Montana Territory, 1872. The vast plains stretched like an endless ocean of grass beneath the wide Montana sky, unbroken save for a small cluster of wooden structures that formed the fledgling town of Whispering Creek. Here, where civilization clung to the wilderness by sheer force of will, Ethan Andrews believed one truth above all: a man survived the frontier alone. Partnership was weakness. Love was a luxury that got folks killed. The 26-year-old rancher straightened his broad shoulders as he guided his wagon down the rutted main street. 6 years of building the Diamond A Ranch had hardened him beyond his years. His handsome face, square-jawed with piercing blue eyes and light stubble that he hadn't bothered to scrape away that morning, remained impassive as townspeople nodded respectfully in his direction. Ethan acknowledged them with the barest tilt of his hat. He wasn't unfriendly, just contained. A man who'd staked his claim on 5,000 acres of prime grazing land needed to project strength. The land demanded it. The cattle demanded it. And the memory of his father, who died when their small family ranch back east had failed, demanded it most of all. "Morning, Mr. Andrews," called the general store owner as Ethan tethered his horses. "Come for those fence posts you ordered?" "And supplies," Ethan replied, his voice deep but quiet. "Expecting a hard winter." The owner nodded. "Almanac says the same. You might consider hiring more hands before the snow flies." Ethan shook his head. "I manage fine with the men I have." The truth was more complicated. The Diamond A had grown too large for his current crew, but taking on more men meant more responsibility, more lives depending on his decisions. Every person added to his circle was one more that could be lost, like his father, like his mother who'd followed her husband to the grave within a year. The frontier had taught Ethan early: attachment was a liability. He was loading the last of his supplies when the commotion started. A wagon train had pulled into town, settlers from back east by the look of their clean clothes and uncertain expressions. Ethan paid them little mind until a woman's scream cut through the air. "Fire! The wagon's on fire!" Ethan turned to see flames licking up the canvas cover of one of the wagons. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the blaze. A young woman was frantically trying to climb into the burning wagon while a man held her back. "My mother's medicine," she cried, struggling against the restraining arms. "She'll die without it." Ethan didn't hesitate. He vaulted into the wagon, the heat searing his lungs as he ducked beneath the burning canvas. Smoke stung his eyes as he scanned the interior. There, a wooden box with a red cross painted on the side. He grabbed it and several other bundles for good measure, then leaped out as the flames consumed the roof. He landed hard, stumbling to one knee before a pair of small hands steadied him. "Oh, thank God," the young woman breathed, taking the medicine box from his arms. "You saved my mother's life." Ethan found himself looking into the most earnest brown eyes he'd ever seen, set in a heart-shaped face framed by honey-blonde hair that had escaped its pins in the commotion. She couldn't have been more than 22. Dressed in a simple blue calico dress, smudged with soot and trail dust. "Just did what needed doing," he muttered, suddenly aware of the townspeople watching. "I'm Josephine Parker," she said, still clutching the medicine box. "We're part of the new settlement group for Clear Creek Valley." Ethan felt a jolt. Clear Creek Valley bordered his northern pasture, the expansion he'd been planning for next spring's herd. "That land's not fit for farming," he said bluntly. Her smile faltered. "The land agent assured us." Land agents will say anything to sell worthless plots to greenhorns. Ethan cut in, harsher than he intended. "That valley floods every spring. You'll lose your crops, maybe your lives." The gratitude in her eyes hardened to determination. "We've sold everything to come here, Mr. Andrews." "Ethan Andrews." "Mr. Andrews. We have nowhere else to go." She straightened her slender shoulders. "And I believe a person can make a home anywhere with enough will." Something in her steadfast gaze unsettled him. He'd seen that look before, in his own reflection when he'd first staked his claim against all advice. But he'd had ranching knowledge. These people were farmers with Eastern notions that would get them killed. "Your will won't stop a flash flood," he said, tipping his hat. "Good day, Miss Parker." As he walked away, Ethan told himself he'd done his duty. He'd warned them. Whatever happened now wasn't his concern. The Diamond A needed his full attention with winter approaching. He had no room for distraction, especially one with honey-blonde hair and determined brown eyes. 3 days later, a storm rolled across the territory that turned gentle creeks into raging torrents. Ethan rode out at dawn to check his northern fence line, the air still heavy with the previous night's rain. As he crested the ridge overlooking Clear Creek Valley, his stomach sank. The valley floor had transformed into a shallow lake. In its center, the wagons of the settlement party stood marooned on a small rise of land. Even from this distance, he could see people huddled on wagon beds and makeshift platforms. "Damn fools," he muttered, even as he turned his horse toward the flooded valley. The water reached his mount's chest in places as Ethan navigated toward the stranded settlers. Their faces, drawn with fear and exhaustion, brightened at his approach. He quickly assessed the situation. 23 people, including children and several elderly, trapped with dwindling supplies. One wagon had already been swept away. "Mr. Andrews." Josephine Parker waded toward him, water at her waist. Her blonde hair was plastered to her face, but her eyes still held that unwavering determination. "We have sick people who need dry ground." For the next 6 hours, Ethan ferried the weakest settlers to safety on his horse, returning with ropes and instructions for building rafts from wagon parts. Josephine worked tirelessly alongside him, never complaining despite her soaked clothes and obvious exhaustion. By nightfall, they'd established a temporary camp on higher ground. Ethan built a large fire as the settlers huddled together, shell-shocked by their narrow escape. "You were right," Josephine said quietly, handing him a tin cup of coffee as they stood apart from the others. "About the valley." Ethan accepted the cup. "Land agents have been selling that valley to newcomers for years. Few last a season." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the displaced families. "My father died on the journey here. My mother's health is failing. I promised them a new start." Her voice caught. "Now I've led these people to disaster." Something in her quiet despair pierced Ethan's carefully constructed armor. He recognized the weight of responsibility she carried, so similar to his own. "There's better land," he found himself saying. "The eastern slope of my property. High ground, good water." Josephine looked at him, surprise replacing despair. "You'd let us settle there?" "Not for free," he said quickly, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her eyes. "We can discuss terms." The next morning, Ethan led the bedraggled group to his ranch. His foreman, Davis, raised his eyebrows but asked no questions as the settlers were settled in the bunkhouse and barn until they could rebuild. "We'll repay your kindness," Josephine promised, standing in his doorway as evening fell. Her blonde hair had dried in soft waves around her face, and someone had found her a dry dress that was slightly too large for her slender frame. "I expect you will," Ethan replied gruffly. "This isn't charity, Miss Parker." Her chin lifted. "I understand business, Mr. Andrews. And I understand that your help today went beyond any business arrangement." Before he could respond, she added, "I ain't pretty, sir, but I can cook. And I notice your men eat poorly. Let me earn my keep by seeing to your kitchen while we arrange for our new settlement." Ethan almost smiled at her candid assessment, which couldn't have been further from the truth. Even trail-worn and exhausted, Josephine Parker was the most naturally beautiful woman he'd seen in the territory. But her offer was practical, and practicality was something he respected. "The kitchen's yours," he agreed. "My men will appreciate a change from beans and bacon." The next morning, Ethan woke to the unfamiliar scent of fresh bread. He found Josephine in his kitchen, flour dusting her cheeks as she worked dough on his table. 3 loaves already cooled by the window, and a pot of something savory bubbled on the stove. "You're up early," he observed, pouring himself coffee from the pot she'd prepared. "Farm habits," she replied with a small smile. "Besides, your men deserve a proper breakfast before their work." When his cowboys filed in for breakfast, their usual rough manners softened in the presence of fresh biscuits and gravy. Ethan watched as Josephine moved efficiently around his kitchen, somehow transforming the sparse room into something that felt dangerously close to a home. As the days passed, Ethan found himself lingering over meals, drawn to Josephine's quiet conversation. She spoke of the families in her group, their skills and hopes. She never mentioned her own dreams, but Ethan caught glimpses in her careful management of resources, in the way she anticipated needs before they were spoken. "You should have been a rancher's wife," he said one evening as they reviewed maps of the eastern slope where her people would settle. She looked up, surprise flickering across her face. That's an odd compliment, Mr. Andrews. Not a compliment. An observation. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with how the lamplight softened her features. You understand what it takes to survive out here. Most Easterners don't. Is that why you live alone? She asked, her gaze direct. Because no one understands? The question hit too close to the truth he never acknowledged. I live alone because it's simpler, he said flatly. No one to worry about. No one to bury. Something in her expression shifted, as though she'd glimpsed a truth he hadn't meant to reveal. That sounds lonely, not simple. Lonely keeps you alive on the frontier, he replied, rolling up the maps with finality. Good night, Miss Parker. That night, Ethan dreamed of his father's funeral, of his mother's wasting grief. But this time, a figure with honey-blonde hair stood beside him at the graves, her small hand steady in his. He woke troubled, the dream clinging like morning mist. The Diamond A had been his singular focus for 6 years, his protection against the pain of loss. Now Josephine Parker and her settlers threatened to complicate everything with their needs, and their gratitude, and their damnable hope. 2 weeks after the flood, as the settlers began constructing cabins on the eastern slope, Whispering Creek's monthly supply train arrived, bringing with it trouble that had nothing to do with Ethan's unsettled emotions. He was loading supplies when a man in an expensive eastern suit approached, flanked by 2 hard-faced men with guns prominently displayed. Mr. Andrews, the man said smoothly. I'm Jonathan Mercer, representing Western Land Development. I understand you've been interfering with my company's business. Ethan straightened to his full height, towering over Mercer. If you mean warning people away from floodlands your company knowingly sells, then yes. Mercer's smile didn't reach his eyes. Those settlers signed contracts. They belong on Clear Creek land that my company needs for access to the railroad spur we're developing. Your company sold them a death trap, Ethan replied coldly. They nearly drowned. Unfortunate, but not my concern. Mercer adjusted his cuffs. I want them removed from your property and back to their contracted plots within 3 days. Or what? Ethan's hand drifted toward his holster. Or we'll remove them ourselves. The law is on our side, Mr. Andrews. Mercer's voice hardened. And should you continue interfering, we might find your own claim has irregularities. After Mercer departed, Ethan rode immediately to the settlement site, where Josephine was directing the placement of cabin logs. We have a problem, he said, dismounting. He explained Mercer's threat as they walked away from the workers. Josephine's face paled. Can he force us back to the valley? Legally, probably. Those contracts you signed likely give him that right. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. But that valley will flood again. You know it, I know it. Then what do we do? The word we caught him off guard. For years, there had been no we in Ethan's life. Yet somehow, in just 2 weeks, this woman and her people had become his responsibility. I don't know, he admitted, but I won't let him force you into danger. That evening, Ethan rode into town alone and sought out Judge Wilson, the nearest thing to legal authority in Whispering Creek. The elderly judge reviewed the settlers' contracts with a deepening frown. These terms are unconscionable, the judge muttered, but unfortunately legal. Western Land Development has powerful connections back east. Those connections won't stop a flood from killing innocent people, Ethan argued. Judge Wilson removed his spectacles. There is one solution. The contracts specify the settlers must establish residency on Western Land property. They don't specifically state which property. Ethan leaned forward. What are you suggesting? Western owns several parcels near the rail line. Dry, safe land they're holding for speculation. If your settlers were to establish improvements on that land instead, they'd technically be fulfilling their contracts. That's Western's prime land. They'll fight it. The judge nodded. Indeed they will. But by the time the legal wheels turn, your settlers would have established residency rights. Western might be forced to honor the original sales, just on different parcels. The plan was risky, but Ethan saw no alternative. He returned to the ranch to find Josephine waiting on his porch, her face tight with worry. We can't go back to that valley, she said before he could speak. 2 of our children nearly drowned. Mrs. Hoffman still hasn't recovered from the pneumonia she caught. I know, Ethan replied, dismounting. I think I have a solution, but it's dangerous. As he outlined the judge's suggestion, Josephine's expression shifted from concern to determination. So we move our settlement to Western's valuable land near the railroad and dare them to remove us. It's a gamble, he acknowledged. If we lose, Western could retaliate against all of you. Against me. She studied him in the fading light. Why are you risking your ranch for us? For me. The question hung between them, demanding a truth Ethan wasn't ready to face. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally. And because I'm tired of watching the frontier destroy good people. 2 days later, under cover of darkness, the settlers dismantled their half-built cabins and moved to a prime parcel of western land near the planned railroad spur. By dawn, they had raised 4 cabin frames and planted the company's own survey stakes around their new boundaries. Mercer's reaction was swift and furious. He arrived with 6 armed men, his face mottled with rage as he confronted Ethan and Josephine before the busy settlement. "This is theft," he shouted. "You're stealing company land." Josephine stepped forward, contract in hand. "We're fulfilling our obligation to establish residency on Western land property, as our contracts require. The contracts don't specify which parcel. This is our premium land, you stupid girl," Mercer snarled. "You were sold worthless floodplains because that's all people like you deserve." Ethan moved between them. "Careful, Mercer. These people have fulfilled their contracts to the letter. Judge Wilson has already reviewed the documentation." "Judge Wilson is a backwater nobody," Mercer spat. "My company has judges on our payroll who matter." He signaled to his men. "Burn it down. All of it." "I wouldn't," Ethan said quietly, as settlers emerged from the cabins, each holding a rifle. "These people have nothing left to lose. Do you really want to explain to your Eastern investors why you started a massacre over a land dispute?" For a tense moment, the confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. Then Mercer stepped back. "This isn't over, Andrews. When the company directors hear about this, they'll destroy you. That ranch of yours will be mine before winter." After Mercer departed, Josephine collapsed onto a stump, her hands shaking. "He'll be back with more men." "Yes," Ethan agreed, sitting beside her. "But not today. And every day you hold this land strengthens your claim." She looked at the busy settlement, at families who trusted her leadership. "I've put them in danger again." "No," Ethan said firmly. "You've given them a fighting chance. More than most get on the frontier." She turned to him, her brown eyes searching his face. "And what about you? Mercer threatened your ranch." The question caught him off guard. For 6 years, the Diamond A had been everything. His purpose, his protection, his fortress against caring too much. Now he'd risked it all for this woman and her people. "Some things matter more than land," he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. That night, as Ethan rode back to his ranch, a rifle shot shattered the silence. Pain exploded in his left shoulder as he tumbled from his horse. He rolled behind a boulder as 2 more shots kicked up dirt around him. Drawing his revolver with his good arm, Ethan waited, listening for movement in the darkness. When a shadow shifted against the starlit sky, he fired twice. A man cried out, then silence fell. Ethan pressed his bandana against his bleeding shoulder, cold realization settling in his gut. Mercer wasn't waiting for legal channels. The fight had already turned deadly. Dawn found Josephine pacing Ethan's porch when his foreman Davis rode in supporting a pale, blood-stained Ethan. "Bushwhacked," Davis explained as they helped Ethan inside. "Found him walking back, horse gone." "Get the doctor," Josephine ordered, already cutting away Ethan's shirt to expose the wound. The bullet had passed clean through his shoulder, missing bone but leaving a ugly, seeping hole. As she cleaned and bandaged the wound, Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness. "Should have listened to me," he murmured. "Frontier's no place for attachments. Gets people killed." "Hush," Josephine soothed, her cool hands gentle on his fevered skin. "No one's dying today." Through the haze of pain and fever that followed, Ethan was aware of Josephine's constant presence. She changed his bandages, spooned broth into his mouth, and read aloud from one of the few books on his shelf. When nightmares gripped him, memories of his father's death, of his mother's grief, her voice anchored him to the present. On the 3rd day, his fever broke. He woke to find Josephine asleep in the chair beside his bed, her blonde hair falling across her face. Something shifted in his chest at the sight, something both terrifying and inevitable. "You should be at the settlement," he said hoarsely. She startled awake. "You're conscious." Relief brightened her tired face as she pressed a hand to his forehead, finally cooling down. The settlers are fine. They've built a defensive perimeter. The men take turns standing watch. She poured him water. Drink. You've been feverish for days. As strength returned, so did Ethan's worry. Mercer won't stop. The shooting proves he's desperate. Then we must be more desperate. Josephine's voice hardened. While you were ill, I sent telegrams to every newspaper in Montana Territory and several back east. I detailed Western's fraudulent land sales, the flooding danger they concealed, and their violent tactics. Ethan stared at her. You what? Companies like Western thrive on secrecy. Their Eastern investors don't want public scandal. Her eyes flashed with determination. So I've given them scandal. A week later, with his arm in a sling, Ethan accompanied Josephine to Whispering Creek. A crowd had gathered outside the telegraph office where the operator was posting a message on the public board. It's from Helena, someone called. The territorial governor has suspended Western Land Development's license pending investigation of fraud charges. A cheer went up from the settlers. Josephine turned to Ethan, her face radiant. We did it. You did it. Ethan corrected, something like pride warming his chest. I just got shot. Her smile faded. Which reminds me, Mercer is still dangerous. More dangerous now that he's desperate. Ethan nodded grimly. I've sent for help. Old army friends who owe me favors. That night, as they rode back toward the settlement, Ethan realized how naturally they had become partners in this fight. The woman who had arrived a month ago as a helpless settler now rode beside him as an equal, her courage and quick thinking earning his deepest respect. And something more. We make a good team, he said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Josephine glanced at him, surprise and something warmer in her eyes. Yes, we do. The admission felt momentous. A crack in the wall he'd built around himself since his parents' deaths. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself to imagine a future that included someone else. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a hint of winter in the air. Ethan was checking fence lines when Davis rode up at full gallop. Mercer, the foreman panted. He's at the settlement with 15 men. They're threatening to burn everything if the settlers don't leave immediately. Cold fear clutched Ethan's heart. Where's Miss Parker? Standing her ground last I saw. She told me to get you. Ethan spurred his horse toward the settlement, his injured shoulder throbbing with each gallop. As he crested the rise overlooking the cabins, he saw Mercer's men forming a circle around the settlers. Josephine stood before her people, facing Mercer directly. This is your last warning, Mercer was saying as Ethan approached. Leave now, or we burn you out. These people have nowhere to go, Josephine replied, her voice carrying clearly. The land you sold them floods regularly. You knew that when you took their money. That's business, sweetheart, Mercer sneered. Not my fault if you're too stupid to check the land before buying. And not my fault if you're too greedy to realize when you've lost, she countered. The territorial governor has suspended your license. Any violence now will only strengthen the case against you. Mercer's face darkened. I don't need a license to rid my land of squatters. He raised his hand to signal his men. I wouldn't, Ethan called, riding into the circle. He dismounted carefully, keeping his good hand near his holster. These people aren't going anywhere. Andrews. Mercer's eyes narrowed. Should have known you'd be behind this. Still alive, I see. No thanks to your hired gun, Ethan replied coldly. Funny thing about bushwhackers, they talk when they're bleeding out. Yours had plenty to say about who paid him. Uncertainty flickered across Mercer's face. You're bluffing. Maybe. But the territorial marshal isn't. He's riding in tomorrow with warrants. This was Ethan's own bluff. The marshal wasn't due for days yet. How many years you think attempted murder gets in these parts? Before Mercer could respond, the sound of approaching riders drew everyone's attention. A dozen men appeared on the ridge. Ethan's former army comrades arrived earlier than expected. Looks like you're outnumbered, Mercer, Ethan said quietly. I suggest you leave while you still can. For a moment, violence hung in the air like an electrical charge. Then Mercer spat on the ground. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. As Mercer and his men rode away, the settlers erupted in cheers. Josephine hurried to Ethan's side, her face tight with concern. Your shoulder's bleeding again, she said, touching the spreading stain on his shirt. You shouldn't have ridden so hard. I wouldn't have made it in time otherwise. He looked down at her, suddenly acutely aware of how close she stood. I couldn't let him hurt you. Something shifted in her expression. Why? The question demanded honesty he'd avoided for weeks. Because I care what happens to you. More than I should. Her hand rose to his face, gentle against his stubbled cheek. I care too. More than is wise for a woman with so many depending on her. The admission hung between them, fragile and momentous. Ethan covered her hand with his own. Josephine. A rider galloped into the settlement, interrupting the moment. Telegraph for Andrews, he called. Urgent news from Helena. The message was brief but definitive. The territorial legislature had revoked Western Land Development's charter and voided their land claims due to fraud. The settlers' rights to their current plots would be honored under new deeds issued by the Territorial Land Office. That night, the settlement celebrated with a bonfire and music. Ethan watched as Josephine moved among her people, accepting their thanks with quiet grace. She had led these families through flood and threat of violence, never wavering in her determination to secure them a home. In that moment, Ethan recognized the truth he'd been fighting for weeks. The fortress of solitude he'd built around himself had already crumbled. This woman, with her courage and compassion, had shown him that isolation wasn't safety. It was just another kind of death. Dance with me, he said, approaching her as the fiddle struck up a waltz. Surprise and pleasure lit her face. Your shoulder will survive one dance. He extended his good arm. I think we've earned it. As they moved slowly around the bonfire, her hand warm in his, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the empty quiet of solitude, but the settled rightness of being exactly where he belonged. I've been thinking, he said as they swayed to the music. Your people need time to establish their farms. First winter's always the hardest. She nodded, looking up at him. We've saved enough for basic supplies, but it will be lean. My ranch needs workers for the winter drive. Good wages for any of your men willing to learn. He hesitated. And I need someone to run my household properly. Someone who understands what it takes to survive out here. Josephine's steps faltered. Are you offering me a job, Mr. Andrews? No. He took a deep breath. I'm asking if you might consider a more permanent arrangement. Between us. Her eyes widened. Ethan Andrews, are you proposing marriage? Poorly, it seems. He stopped dancing, facing her directly. I've lived alone because I believed attachment was weakness. That caring for people only led to pain when the frontier inevitably took them. He touched her cheek gently. But you've shown me that true strength comes from standing together. That a life without connection isn't really living at all. Tears shimmered in her eyes. I ain't pretty, sir, but I can cook, she whispered, echoing her first offer to him. Ethan smiled, truly smiled, for what felt like the first time in years. Josephine Parker, you are the most beautiful woman I've ever known. And I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife. Yes, she said simply. I will. 3 months later, as winter settled across the Montana Territory, the Diamond A Ranch hosted a Christmas celebration unlike any in its history. The great room of the ranch house, expanded now with a new wing, was filled with settlers from the community that had taken root on Western's former land. Judge Wilson had performed the wedding ceremony 2 weeks earlier, uniting Ethan and Josephine in a partnership that already showed signs of transforming the Diamond A. The bunkhouse had been improved, new cottages built for married hands, and plans made for a schoolhouse come spring. As twilight fell, Ethan found Josephine by the window, watching snow drift across the yard. He wrapped his arms around her waist, drawing her back against his chest. Any regrets? He asked softly. Taking on a stubborn rancher and all his troubles? She turned in his embrace, her eyes bright with contentment. Not one. She rose on tiptoes to kiss him. Though I still maintain you got the worse end of the bargain. Ethan laughed, the sound no longer unfamiliar to his own ears. I got everything I never knew I wanted. He brushed a strand of honey blonde hair from her face. A partner. A home that's more than just land and cattle. And a cook, she teased. The best cook in the territory, he agreed solemnly, then grew serious. You saved me, Josephine. Not just from Mercer and his men, but from myself. From the fortress I'd built that was becoming my prison. She rested her head against his chest. We saved each other. That's what love does on the frontier. It gives us someone to stand beside when the storms come. As the settlers' children gathered to sing carols, Ethan held his wife close, marveling at how completely his world had transformed. The man who once believed the frontier was no place for love now knew the opposite truth. It was precisely because the frontier was harsh that love was essential. Not a weakness to be avoided, but the very foundation of survival. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the Diamond A in pristine white. But inside, warmth and laughter filled every corner of the house that had once echoed with one man's solitude. In Josephine's eyes, Ethan saw not just the present joy, but the promise of all the seasons to come, a future they would build together, one day at a time, on the foundation of a love strong enough to tame the wildest frontier.